Let me start with a couple comments about why I wrote this book. I'm an economist by training and also a Japan specialist by training. Every other book I have written has been about either the Japanese economy, U.S.-Japan economic relations, or kind of East Asia economic relations. So the topic of this book is a little outside my field. But it's something that I'd wanted to write for a long time, and it came from being a lonely economist in a sea of political scientists, both at work at the Brookings Institution. I was in foreign policy studies, and most people there were not doing economic issues. I and one other person, Nick Lardy, working on the Chinese economy. That was it. Everybody else was doing nuclear weapons control or the problems in the Middle East and things like that. But more specifically, I spent most of the 1980s and 90s going to endless conferences about Japan or Northeast Asia in which I would once again be a lonely economist. And I would write papers and do presentations trying to explain to people why economic issues were relevant to the so-called broader issues that were the subject of the conference, basically war and peace in East Asia. And I'd do my little presentation, and then the other people say, oh, thank you very much. Now let's go back to talking about the really important stuff, like, when are the North Koreans going to get nuclear weapons, which then they did. And, I got to admit that war and peace, life and death, these are heady issues. And it's real easy to kind of get sucked into the immediate political, military issues related to them. And yet, as an economist, I'd long believed that, although certainly I don't believe in economic determinism, that economics matters for these big issues of life and death around the world. And so maybe it was time for an economist to speak up and try to say a few things. Granted, this has been done before. There is a whole theory called, it's the liberal school in international relations, guys like Joe Nye, Robert Cohen, Robert Gilpin, Richard Rosecrans, have written books on why increasing international economic connections should push the world in a more peaceful direction. But they tend to come at this from a political science standpoint. I thought, well, maybe I can come at it a little differently as an economist. So that's really what motivated me to write this book. I realized there was a danger in doing this because one of the very first things that one of my colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations told me when I said I was doing this book, he said, oh, you got to go read Norman Angell, who was an Englishman who wrote a book in 1912 that was basically the same subject, that said, war has become useless and silly. We don't gain from it, and we can gain in other ways from non-military things. And political scientists have laughed at him ever since because, of course, that was 1912. And what happened after that? 2 world wars. And so people say, oh, Norman Angell, he really got it wrong. Well, it turns out he didn't. And some people say, well, Norman Angell predicted that there'd be no more wars, which he didn't. He simply said that was stupid. In fact, he wrote the book in part because he was trying to counteract the building tension that was going on between England and Germany right at that point in time. So I think the war was no surprise to him. He was just trying to get the point across that nobody was going to benefit from it. That's not how we prosper in the world these days, which I think was actually a good insight.